50 years on, the feud continues as a surprising number of people still believe that we never landed on the moon. The question lies at the heart of one of the greatest conspiracy theories of all time. A theory born from an era of global suspicion, political mistrust, and fake news. The whole Apollo program was a complete fabrication. The idea that it could have been hoaxed is quite frankly insane. But when put to the test, can we unlock the scientific truth and once and for all put these conspiracy theories to rest? Congratulations. In the 21st century, one of the greatest achievements in history still remains a source of controversy. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. Did the Apollo moon landings really happen? Or were they the biggest hoax of all time? Trevor Weaver has dedicated years of research to the Apollo missions and was once a supporter of the moon landings. We didn't go to the moon, and that is an established fact. NASA provided all the topographical data they had, all the photographs, all the massive models to Stanley Kubrick so they could actually fake moon scenes. Could the moon landings actually have been faked by Hollywood director Stanley Kubrick? The history books say otherwise. Apollo 11 astronaut Edwin "Buzz" Aldrin spent 3 days traveling to the moon and was the first to follow Neil Armstrong's historic footsteps. Beautiful. I'm totally in favor of freedom of speech, but I think people need to be responsible when they think about intentionally misleading the young people who are the future leaders of our world. Moon conspiracy theorists have been a small but persistent and vocal group over the years, often confronting and accusing astronauts of lying. In 2002, when conspiracy theorist Bart Sibrel buttonholed Buzz Aldrin, his temper got the better of him. "You're the one who said you walked on the moon when you didn't. Calling a kettle black if I ever thought of saying I misrepresented myself. Get away from me. You're a coward and a liar and a thief." The punch stirred a generation less trusting of traditional media, more open to believing fake news and theories spread on the internet, and revived the moon landing hoax theories. NASA never realized that we would have something called the internet. It's only now, when all those videos are available, that people can see what the problems are. I think the propagation of so-called fake news, the spread, which is very welcome, of access to the internet means that we have far more sources than we used to. There is a real crisis in understanding the strength of those sources. People often have some kind of distrust of authority, governments and so on, and they assume that there's some kind of plot to keep the information from us, that actually the propaganda victory of going to the moon could be based on something that was entirely fabricated. But if the Apollo missions were faked, it would mean NASA had managed to keep one of the biggest secrets ever created. 50 years ago, the Soviet Union and the USA were locked in a struggle for global dominance. Then on October 4th, 1957, the Soviets launched Sputnik, the world's first satellite, into orbit. A breakthrough that hit America hard and made the race to space even more crucial. There's no doubt that the space race in the 1960s was driven by a superpower rivalry. There was a degree of anxiety in the West about the advancement in Soviet technology. The feeling the West somehow had lost its leadership and needed to catch up. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things not because they are easy, but because they are hard. At the peak of the Apollo program, NASA employed 400,000 people. But was putting a man on the moon so important that the United States government faked it? If so, a legion of NASA employees not only participated in the deception, but they kept the secret from the rest of the world. That was such a seminal event that it wasn't just about the mission itself, but the way that that influenced wider life. You know, people began to think, oh, we can do space travel, we can actually go to other worlds. On July the 16th, 1969, the 3 Apollo 11 astronauts prepared for liftoff. But while the world eagerly awaited history to be made, one man was already skeptical. During the 1960s, Bill Kaysing was the head of technical publications for Rocketdyne, the company that helped manufacture the Apollo rockets. Kaysing, who claimed he had access to some of its top secret documents, questioned the competence of the Apollo project. "I really believe that they weren't in the command capsule at launch. They did a little bit of a magician act with the astronauts. They went up the elevator, but they came down the elevator. In other words, They did not want to risk the lives of the astronauts in case the Saturn blew up. An explosive claim, which Casing said the CIA tried to silence by making 3 attempts on his life. Like Casing, Marcus Allen, British publisher of Nexus, a magazine of alternative politics, history and science, also questions NASA's engineering capability at the time of the launches. The problem is the whole Apollo program was a complete fabrication in order to be seen to succeed in the Cold War. The myth of Apollo is what is holding NASA back from future space travel. It's a tragedy. We didn't go the first time. We can't go now. We've never been. They lied to us. But if NASA didn't put a man on the moon, it would have had to fake the evidence. And its own visual images have done the most to fuel conspiracy theories. Every photograph taken on the lunar surface is on line 5,771. Some of them are not particularly good. Some are out of focus. Some are light struck. Some just don't show very much of interest. And some of them are very good indeed. And it's the very good ones I question. I do not believe they were taken on the moon. They were taken here on Earth. Conspiracy theorists believe NASA faked all 6 of the Apollo moon landings and point to these NASA photographs as proof. Some of the most renowned claims suggest that areas lit from behind should be in dark shade, when in fact they reveal full detail. In others, the shadows don't run parallel. Is this because they were lit by separate sources, suggesting film lighting? Despite being taken in space, no stars are visible in any of the Apollo photographs. Gravity on the moon is 1/6 of that on Earth. But when archive footage is sped up, the astronauts appear to be running at normal speed in Earth's gravity. And with no atmosphere on the moon, why does the flag seem to wave in a breeze? For the purpose of this program, we filmed an experiment on a lunar set built in the Trona Pinnacles in the Californian desert to challenge the hoax theories and put these claims to the test. By testing some of the most famous conspiracy arguments and addressing new evidence, can we put the lunar hoax theories to rest once and for all? This is Apollo Control Houston at 105 hours. Now under the flight Apollo 11, people all over the world were eagerly tuned in to the historic event. Astronomer Sir Patrick Moore reported the mission live on British television. Ever since the dawn of human history, we dreamed about going to other worlds, and this was the first time it had been done. And of course, it was an exciting time and also a very tense one. 5-4-3-2-1-0 liftoff. We have a liftoff. There were some amateur radio enthusiasts who built a very large dish and were able to actually listen in to the astronauts talking from the moon's surface. They didn't hear mission control. They were able to pick up just the astronauts by themselves. Ian Morrison witnessed the event from a unique perspective. A student at the Jodrell Bank Radio Telescope near Manchester, England, he took advantage of the facilities and listened into the mission of his own accord. I should say that we were not officially tracking the Apollo craft. We were doing this for fun, our own fun and our own interest. We could hear the whole conversation of the astronauts all the way down to the surface. They were obviously highly excited, and it must have been wonderful as they sort of literally reached the surface. Out my left-hand window right now, I can observe the entire continent of North America. Okay, engine stop. We copy you down, Eagle. Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed. And then Neil's voice came through. The Eagle has landed. And that for me was a moment of intense relief. And since I was on the air live, I had to watch what I said. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. In 1969, the public had little reason to question mankind's historic first step on the moon. After all, the achievement was a celebration of technological supremacy. America had finally won the space race. Mankind's first steps on the moon have become the epicenter of hoax theories. Conspiracy theorists claim NASA faced a formidable challenge with its primitive 1960s technology. Just 14 months before the Apollo 11 mission, Neil Armstrong test-piloted a prototype lunar lander. The result was disastrous. Unfortunately, it went out of his control, and luckily he was able to eject before it crashed in flames. If they couldn't get a simulator to work on Earth, how in the world could they get the actual lunar module to work on the moon? And of course I knew both Neil and Buzz, there was no professional rescue. Had they made a faulty landing, they couldn't have got back. That would have been too ghastly to contemplate. conspiracy theorists question not only the technical capabilities of the landing craft, but also the computing power that guided it. They didn't have the technology to do it, and the risk is too great. They could not afford to risk failure. They wouldn't allow themselves to rely on science and technology to get them there. Pat Norris is a former space system and software engineer hired by NASA to analyze the challenges of navigating to the moon and back. In the 1950s, computers didn't really exist, but by the mid-1960s, computers were available that were powerful enough to do the calculations needed for such a complicated mission. Of course, by comparison with today's computers, they were very primitive. While these advancements should surely encourage a new line of missions, conspiracy theorists argue that this is enough to question if we ever could have gone in the first place. We're talking about the mid-1960s here, when computers occupied rooms. The sort of computing power that you have in a mobile phone today would be greater than the computing power that was alleged to have been used to land man on the moon. One of the reasons that we had difficulty in navigating close to the moon was that the computers available weren't able to provide a sufficiently detailed mathematical model of the moon's gravity. Perhaps there wasn't enough information, but even if there had been enough information, the computers probably wouldn't have been able to cope with it. They were adequate for the mission at the time, but only just. Unlike modern-day PCs, the Apollo computers didn't have to store files or process images. Most of the number crunching was done at mission control, and the information transmitted back to the astronauts. In their attempt to disprove the missions, conspiracy theorists have analyzed the footage of the moon landings frame by frame. One of the most famous pieces of footage in history is Buzz Aldrin's dance across the moonscape. Near the end of the 2.5 hours in front of the television camera, I did have an opportunity to prance around and hop and demonstrate different methods of moving around. The movement, because of the restrictions of the spacesuit, was basically like being in slow motion. The famous lunar walk shows Aldrin experimenting with the restrictions of the spacesuit. So-called kangaroo hop does work, but it seems your forward ability is not quite as good. Conspiracy theorists have claimed that the footage was actually filmed in slow motion in a studio, and that the astronauts were supported by wires to replicate these movements on the moon. The astronaut is dangling on a wire to take off, if you like, the difference between the Earth's gravity and the moon's gravity. The wire was between the backpack and the body. The problem is the astronauts tended to rely on this wire. So you see lots of jerky movement. Astronauts were wearing pretty big and bulky spacesuits, and the weight distribution isn't the same as you or I walking around on the surface of the Earth here. The astronauts had to really cope with that and work out, if they're top heavy, how to move around such that they weren't going to fall over all the time and be unbalanced. You do have to be rather careful to keep track of where your center of mass is. You can see that astronauts really adapted really well to that and started to kind of develop this new walk. While the exact conditions of the moon couldn't be replicated on Earth, NASA introduced methods to adapt the astronauts. One of their favorite methods was parabolic flight, or as the astronauts called it, the vomit comet. By climbing and diving in a series of arcs, an aeroplane could simulate 3 0-second windows of reduced gravity. These sessions served as road tests for the spacesuits and gave astronauts their first taste of lunar gravity. If, as the conspiracy theorists claim, NASA faked the Apollo missions, then it also had to fake the photographic evidence. I was trained as a photographer in London back in the 1960s. I was familiar with the camera that was used, the Hasselblad camera, and also with the film that was used, Kodak Ektachrome transparency material. Also siding with Marcus, American conspiracy theorist Ralph Rene raised a different technical question. Could the gloves the astronauts wore on their pressurized spacesuits have actually worked on the moon? What I do is I pull a vacuum in this chamber I created, and I have a glove inserted inside of it, and it was to prove that the flexibility they shown in their suits and gloves are impossible. Right now I can put my hand in there and I can move it every which way. I can grasp, I make a fist, I can lift up, down, but as soon as I throw this switch here, I evacuate the chamber. As air is sucked out of the machine, the vacuum makes it more and more difficult to move the glove, and this glove doesn't want to move. I can't bend it backwards, I can hardly force it down. If it seems impossible to operate a camera properly in pressurized gloves, how could these perfect pictures have been taken? Trained aerospace engineer Jay Windley has extensively researched the moon landing conspiracies and was present at the experiment on the moon set to refute these theories. This is a Hasselblad 500 camera manufactured specially for the lunar missions. You'd attach to the spacesuit via this bayonet. The camera would have a framework surrounding the bottom and rear of the camera, and it would slide down onto the control unit here so that the astronaut could work with his hands without worrying about the camera. Lunar cameras didn't have a viewfinder because the astronauts' helmets prevented them from looking down and framing the shot. Basically, you could just sort of point that camera at what you wanted without having to really look through a viewfinder. But according to conspiracy theorists, this was a problem that couldn't be solved. They had to focus it, set the shutter speed, set the aperture by hand, wearing armored gauntlets, and you can't see the shutter button on a Hasselblad. It's on the front of the camera. You didn't know if you'd taken a photograph because you can't hear anything in space, and you can't see the counter dial put on the side of the camera. So with all those restrictions, we have some of the most iconic images ever taken in the 20th century. I don't believe it. I'll step out and take some of my first pictures here. Jay Windley investigated how these design features on the Hasselblad would have been operated by the astronauts. The Zeiss Biogon lens here has been fitted with these little paddles to allow the astronaut to manipulate them with clumsy fingers. You just push it in either direction. The shutter release, normally a very small button, has been made especially large so that it can be pressed with an astronaut's glove. The focus ring has been fitted with stops that correspond to near, medium, far, and infinity. So he didn't have to pay attention to whether he was 8 feet or 9 feet away from a subject. Richard Underwood was responsible for teaching Apollo astronauts the art of lunar photography. Even in the early days before they went to moon, I'd say, when you get back from this journey, you will be a national hero, but your photographs, I say, if they're good, they'll live forever. The astronauts were told to take their lunar cameras everywhere they went and practice. They took them home to photograph their friends and family and barbecues and sporting events and all other types of things. They knew that camera very, very effectively. All of the crew members understood pretty well how to operate this, and the film turned out to be very, very versatile in coming up with just outstanding results. But these outstanding results led to one of the most famous photographic anomalies, the strange case of the lunar shadows. The shadows are one of the strong proofs that we never went to the moon. If you examine pictures offered by NASA as genuine, you find that in many cases the shadows are not parallel. Well, since the sun was the only source of light, all shadows on the moon should be exactly parallel. But they aren't, because the lunar shadows fall in different directions. Some conspiracy theorists claim that they were created by separate artificial light sources. There's only one sun, there are not two. But these shadows are anomalous in that sometimes they are diverging from objects and sometimes converging. You can go any place on this planet when the sun's up, and you look at two objects, and those sun shadows are parallel. But according to physicists, there are reasonable explanations for why we find that shadows aren't always parallel. There's lots of different things which can make shadows go in different directions. I mean, obviously you have shadows pointing away from the sun, but if your camera is a wide-angle camera, you will get a perspective effect on the shadows. The effect of converging shadows is a well-known optical phenomenon in photography. This effect is created where there is a single light source. For both the moon and the Earth, this source is the sun. If you have bits of topography on the surface, like troughs, they can produce shadows which appear to be at right angles to the main direction of the sun. But if we look at the photos, Aldrin appears to be brightly lit up. Shouldn't the astronaut's body be in darkness? He's standing in a pool of light. It's a spotlight. It's not the sun. On the moon, you're not just illuminated by the sun shining towards you and casting a shadow behind you, but there's also a huge area of the lunar surface around you, and that provides backlight to any subject on the moon's surface. You can also get reflections of light off bright objects like spacesuits if they're fairly close to whatever they're illuminating, and specifically the light bouncing off the highly reflective lunar module. In these pictures, you can clearly see where a pool of light appears. If you look at pictures where the astronauts are away from the module, the surface appears evenly lit. Another cause for suspicion among conspiracy theorists is Apollo's symbolic highlight, the American flag. Wherever there's an American flag, it's always brilliantly lit up, even if it's on the shadow side. The flag they took to the moon was made of nylon, which is fairly translucent material. It lets light through, so I wouldn't expect to see one side bright and one side dark. Here we can see our flag brightly lit from the front, but if we move around to the back, we can see that even with our single light source, it's still brightly lit. The light is shining through and making the flag glow. But why does the lunar flag wave around if there's no wind on the moon? The astronauts had to drive the flagstaff into the hard lunar surface with a twisting motion. A horizontal aluminium rod kept the flag suspended, and this caused the free end of the flag to flip up and back in response to that. Also, this is an aluminum tube, very similar to the ones used on the Apollo mission. It's very springy. If I cause it to spring and then let go of it, we see that this motion continues long after I've let go of it. Once it's in the surface, then those oscillations gradually dampen away over time. Conspiracy theorists point to another strange anomaly. As the 16-ton landing craft touched down, its powerful rockets would be expected to blast away the top layer of dust, exposing the rocky lunar surface. But footprints were visibly photographed beneath the spacecraft, and there seems to be no dust on the landing pads. One of the problems that was encountered, of course, is lunar dust. The moon is covered with it. Prior to landing on the moon, they'd sent unmanned landers. One of the concerns was the fact the lunar surface might actually be so dusty that any spacecraft that tried to land on it might actually sink in it. Ralph Rene devised an experiment to illustrate his notion that the rocket-powered lander should have left a crater. If a garden leaf blower, which is dramatically less powerful, can move dust with Earth's gravity, why didn't a rocket, which produced 10,000 pounds of thrust? Now, that's not the case, because when they were coming in, they'd already throttled down to at least about a quarter of the maximum thrust, and just above the surface, they turned off the rocket motors. So any exhaust was actually pretty feeble when it landed on the moon's surface. And a closer inspection of some of the photographs reveals that the landing did in fact disturb a very fine layer of dust, but not enough to cover the landing pads. But the NASA images from the mission aren't the only proof of the module landing on the surface. Satellite images taken of the lunar surface in more recent years could suggest more compelling evidence of the Apollo landings. The Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter is a robotic spacecraft launched by NASA in 2009 to orbit the moon. Using very high-resolution cameras and being relatively close to the moon's surface, it has actually been able to pick out each of the 6 Apollo landing sites. Alongside the lunar reconnaissance images, evidence from other missions have also been able to confirm the Apollo landing sites. The Chinese and the Japanese, with their own lunar missions, were able to image the areas in which the landings took place, and there is evidence of soil disturbance. So you do have that third-party verification that the landings themselves took place. There's one more big question conspiracy theorists ask about the Apollo 11 photographs. With no weather on the moon, you would expect a spectacular view of space. Yet there are no stars in the Apollo photographs. On the moon, the eye, like the camera aperture, can't adjust to the brightness of the lunar surface and the darkness of space at the same time. If you increase the aperture or the exposure time to capture the stars, the foreground would be completely washed out. Our experiment in the desert demonstrates that the stars could not have been seen in the photographs taken on the lunar surface. But this explanation doesn't satisfy magazine publisher Marcus Allen. He believes it's impossible that any of these photographs could survive a journey to the moon and back in the first place. Photographic film cannot withstand the vacuum of space. So, how did they get all these fantastic photographs we've been shown forever about Apollo astronauts on the moon when the film was not in a pressurized environment, let alone radiation protection? After leaving the Earth's atmosphere, the astronauts rocketed through the Van Allen belts. Van Allen. He said it was a sea of deadly radiation. You would pick up a death dose just about the time you got through the Van Allen shield. When NASA designed the trajectory to go through the Van Allen radiation belt, it was done so the astronauts would go very, very quickly through there so they wouldn't get a very high dosage. And they also picked a part of the Van Allen radiation belt, which the levels of radiation were quite weak. Just 3 months after the Apollo 16 mission, NASA admitted that a violent solar flare hit the moon's surface, an eruption so powerful it could have killed the astronauts had they been there. For conspiracy theorists, radiation is the final nail in the coffin. They believe the astronauts could never have survived a trip to the moon and back. But could the objects they returned with also be the key to unlocking secrets from the lunar surface itself? and provide a definitive answer to the question, did we really land on the moon? Conspiracy theorists believe that the moon rock from the missions was just another part of NASA's carefully engineered deception. In total, the Apollo missions brought back over 382 kilograms of lunar soil and rock. These samples were distributed to laboratories all over the world. At the independent Berkeley Geochronology Center in California, geologist Paul Wren has been studying lunar rock samples throughout his career. Using a laser heating system to release gases locked inside tiny glass spheres, Paul Wren looks for evidence of cosmic radiation to uncover clues about their age and place of origin. The results that we obtained are absolutely definitive proof of a lunar origin. I can say with utmost assurance that they were derived from the moon. But it's evidence the astronauts left behind and not what they brought back that may offer the clinching proof. Each successful Apollo mission set up a range of experiments, and 50 years after Apollo 11, the lunar laser ranging is still in use. The reflectors placed by the Apollo 11 crew allowed scientists to achieve greater accuracy about the Earth's position in the solar system. Pretty much anybody in the world with a big telescope and a powerful laser can bounce lasers off of those reflectors and measure the distance to the moon. If NASA had faked this, surely the Russians would have exposed the legitimacy of this half a century ago. At the height of the space race, the Soviet Union and East Germany also had the technology to listen in on the Apollo missions, and yet they remained silent. For all the effort it would take to create and hide a lie of such magnitude, it would have been far easier for NASA to build a rocket and put man on the moon.